Serenade to Music, which must be one of the loveliest of all Vaughan Williams' compositions. It's conducted here by Sir Adrian Bolt. Now, in this programme, I want to take you back further into the past than that record, made only 20 years ago, back to what, as far as recorded sound is concerned, was another age. So, adjust your listening a little as we turn to the year 1938, to the first recording of the work, conducted by the man to whom it was dedicated, and sung by the 16 soloists who were brought together for its first performance. The Serenade to Music was written to celebrate the Golden Jubilee of Sir Henry Wood. To honour, that is, 50 glorious years, during which he became a kind of father figure to the large family of British music makers and their public, starting with that New Year's Day in 1888, when he conducted the All Saints Choral and Orchestral Society in Clapton. 50 years later, a great concert was arranged in the Albert Hall to honour him, and to raise some money for the Jubilee Fund to endow beds in London hospitals for the benefit of orchestral musicians. That was on October the 5th, 1938. The orchestras of the BBC, the London Philharmonic, the London Symphony and the Queen's Hall were to play. The choirs included the Philharmonic, the Royal Choral Society and the BBC Chorus. Rachmaninoff was the soloist in his second piano concerto, and a new work was commissioned to be written by Vaughan Williams. It was to be choral, and it was to involve some of the soloists who'd worked most closely with Sir Henry. Otherwise, Vaughan Williams was given a free hand. He decided it would be an opportunity to fulfill a long-cherished wish to set that most beautiful passage at the start of the last act of The Merchant of Venice, where the lovers, Jessica and Lorenzo, sit in the moonlight and praise the power of music. He also thought he saw his way to accommodate a company of 16 soloists. Here's how Ursula Vaughan Williams first heard of the plan.
Well, we were having one of our morning telephone conversations, and Ralph said that he had been asked to write a piece for Henry Wood's Jubilee, and he'd always wanted to set the Jessica and Lorenzo scene from The Merchant of Venice. And so I said, but 8 Jessicas, 8 Lorenzos. Ah, you wait and see, he said, you wait and see. And that's the first news I had of it. It seized the opportunity to do something that he'd long thought needed music. And I must say, when I go to the play, I cannot think why there isn't music when that scene begins.
When the work was published, everybody could see from the score how careful Vaughan Williams had been to use the singers as individuals. Their initials were set against their respective solos, and even in the choral sections, such as the opening that you heard just now, it was specified which of them was to sing the first or second voice when the parts divided. And they were each given a short solo, specially written with their voices in mind. It was one of his great pleasures in writing the work.
He enjoyed doing it because naturally he knew all the soloists, and it was fun. There's a sort of technical fun that people have that both enjoyed very much, making each part fit a particular voice. And as you'll know from that early recording, they were very individual voices.
They were indeed. And the particular voices were, of course, among those most familiar to the public in those days. Household names, many of them. Such as the soprano whose solo came first, Isabel Bailey. Her clear, reliably produced notes, at the time as pure as a choir boy's or Nellie Melba's, must have been in Vaughan Williams' mind when he wrote that phrase, taking the soprano, like the lark ascending, up to a sustained high A. And perhaps at the back of his mind was something he'd written a good time ago, at the end of the first movement of his first symphony, finished in 1909, the C Symphony, in which Isabel Bailey would often sing the soprano solo, as she does here in this recording. Again, taking the soprano up to a high A in the key of D major, a sort of gentle benediction, with Isabel Bailey's as the ideal voice for it. She herself said that her part in the Serenade to Music terrified her. It was truly an ordeal, she recalled in her autobiography, and I think I lost a lot of weight worrying about those 3 bars. But Bella, as she was called by her colleagues, says they encouraged her and that they all got along swimmingly, which is certainly how the 3 surviving singers remember the occasion.
I think really, to put it very bluntly, very plainly, we all were very, very happy. And I don't think there was a moment when any of us were nervous. And I don't quite believe Bella. I wish she'd said it to me. I would have said never, she wouldn't have reached that note as she did if she'd been nervous.
That was Mary Jarrett, one of the 4 contraltos, who also made the point that in a unique way it presented a challenge, this business of a solo of 3 or 4 bars length, specially written, and to be delivered on this very special occasion.
I think I never worked at anything harder than I worked at that, to make it really a success, you know, because it's so difficult to do little in so short a time, to make it full of feeling. It's not easy.
Mary Jarrett. It was a notable event in these singers' careers. For one thing, they felt it an honour to be among those chosen. And it was a bitter disappointment to Keith Faulkner, for instance, when, although he was originally among the listed singers, and actually named in Jessie Wood's account as being one of them, he found himself engaged in the United States and unable to join them. Lady Wood's description of the first rehearsal tells that the singers were so moved that their lips seemed unable to articulate. The survivors don't remember it quite like that, but emotion certainly ran deep. Dame Eva Turner.
We were all very moved, and more especially when, facing us absolutely, when we were rehearsing on the platform, Vaughan Williams appeared at that central entrance and stood there like an old farmer, really, you know, with his hands behind his back and listening. Oh, it was lovely. And then Sir Henry took us all for a marvellous lunch, and I think that was to Grosvenor House. Wonderful. Oh, it was a lovely atmosphere, a lovely altogether.
Roy Henderson also has a vivid memory of that day and the special place it had in Sir Henry's professional career, for an unexpected reason.
Now, remember, the first rehearsal we had was at the Royal Academy of Music, where Sir Henry was conducting. That was with the piano in the morning. And then the next rehearsals would have been there at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And Henry took us all to lunch. And the conversation interested him so much that he, for once in his life, forgot the time. Sir Henry, who'd never been late for anything, and he was about 7 minutes late, about the first and only time in his life for the orchestral rehearsal.
Of the 3 living singers, Mary Jarrett and Roy Henderson, now 89, and Dame Eva at 96, all speak with affection of the music, the concert, Sir Henry and their colleagues. And it's good to recall that they were the guests of honour at the Albert Hall last summer, when the serenade was given chorally in memory of its first performance 50 years earlier. For them, it must have been moving to have in their minds the voices once so well known to them and now stilled. Roy Henderson, a baritone, remarked that the tenors were the first to go.
Tenors, funny thing, they all died first, every one of them, before anybody else. In spite of Frank Titterton having an apothecary's case, which he went round with everywhere, and if anybody was ill in any sort of way, he'd always got something for them.
Heddle Nash, Frank Titterton, Walter Widdop and Parry Jones, those were the tenors. And they were the first in the work to have a section to themselves. We'll hear them in that order, the lines beautifully suited to the voices, with the first 3 marking a development from the lyric through the dramatic to the heroic tenor. And then Parry Jones, a voice on his own, sharper cut, less warm and generous in tone, giving the one slightly sour negative sentence in the piece. That fitting of Parry Jones's voice was so right in the tone it caught. One of his most successful records was of Peter Warlock's song, The Fox, and his operatic career had as one of its last triumphs the supremely foxy character of Prince Shuisky in Boris Godunov. It was matched in the Vaughan Williams work by his finding exactly the right phrase for the soprano Elsie Sotheby. She had the lightest of the voices, the fresh tone of youth and innocence, and a very English sound. A few years later, on November the 5th, 1944, she was the soprano soloist in Vaughan Williams' Thanksgiving for Victory, and it was her voice that brought that work to a close. This is the voice to which, in the Serenade to Music, Vaughan Williams gave the words, "I am never merry when I hear sweet music." He took care to reduce the orchestration, which carries a suggestion of Purcell and the early music, of which in her time Elsie Sotheby was a notable exponent. All of her colleagues and the critics, in their comments on the work, instanced that little solo for Elsie Sotheby as one of the most striking examples of Vaughan Williams' skill and consideration in writing for the individual singers. But all were well looked after. For instance, after the tenors have sung their section, ending with the sombre unison "We cannot hear it," the mood suddenly changes, and a new musical motif enters with the courtly splendour of trumpets and a soprano of the full-bodied, lyric dramatic type. As she takes a ringing high A, quite different from the sort that falls to Isabel Bailey, all the other voices enter, and briefly this nocturne lights up in a blaze of gorgeous colour. The soloist was Lillian Stiles Allen. It's rather sad to think that today only comparatively few listeners are likely to remember her, compared with, say, Isabel Bailey or Hedel Nash, for she made hardly any gramophone records. In her time, she stood high in the respect of singers and their public, but she was a large lady, and the operatic stage was not for her. At school, her headmaster gave her the nickname of Brunhilde at the age of 9. And indeed her voice developed to be a very powerful one. She always said that it was a difficult voice to record, and that's why she made so few records. Anyway, that makes her part in the Serenade to Music a particularly precious memory. The next voices to be heard on block are the baritones and basses. The four singers, in order of their solos, were Harold Williams, Roy Henderson, Robert Easton, and Norman Allen, the deepest of the voices, comes last. They have the famous lines about the man that hath no music in himself. Let no such man be trusted. They all agree. Again, the fitting of the voices has an uncanny rightness. Harold Williams, the Australian, with his fine, forthright style and sturdy tone, opens the section, and you feel he's the very opposite of the man without music, the man whom you can't trust. Then, raising the vocal line for a high baritone and still restraining the orchestra, Vaughan Williams writes for Roy Henderson, who, as I said, is one of the three still with us. We heard his speaking voice earlier on. Let me play you just a little of a record he made of Vaughan Williams' early song, Orpheus with his lute.
In sweet music
In the Serenade to Music, Roy Henderson's phrase is about the man who is not moved with concord of sweet sounds. Then comes a darkening as the first of the basses enters. Such men, he says, are fit for treasons, stratagems and spoils. Here you have Robert Easton, and though his part was, I believe, first written for Keith Faulkner, the big, vibrant voice has a fine, sinister effect. The second bass concludes, "The motions of his spirits dull as night, and his affections dark as Erebus," and Norman Allen's voice sinks to cavernous depths. Allen had one of those unequivocal, deep bass voices that we don't hear very often these days. He and others of his kind, like Robert Radford, were the model for all cathedral choir basses in the country. And of course all that has changed. The desired sound on the bass line is now much lighter, and the singers of that generation would probably not regard their present-day successors as real basses at all. Here's Norman Allen in the second half of Schubert's Death and the Maiden. The short solo in the Serenade to Music doesn't really plumb such depths, taking him down only to an A-flat. But the final chords of the whole piece have the bottom bass on a low D, the final note in that record of Death and the Maiden, and against this are the initials N.A. The Serenade's a fine work structurally, quite apart from the writing for voices, and now, after the basses section, there reappears, but more quietly and in a lower key, the fanfare motif that we heard introducing the soprano in Come Ho and Wake Diana with a Hymn. Now it has rather more the glow of moonshine, and it introduces the mellow tones of the first contralto. Music, hark, she sings. And then, with Vaughan Williams leading the piece back to the theme of the prelude, as though coming home, the singer answers, as in the play, it is the music of the house. Some of the most lovely phrases go to these singers, who nevertheless are not so easy to identify as the others. Muriel Brunskill comes first, followed by Astrid Esmond, then Mary Jarrett. As with Roy Henderson, we heard Mary Jarrett's speaking voice, and I'd like to give you just a brief reminder of her singing in other music. She too, like Styles Allen, was one of those singers with a central position in the musical life of her time who were under-recorded. No complete oratorios, for instance, as Muriel Brunskill had. No catalogue of song recordings, such as you find under Astrid Esmond's name. But she sang the role of the sorceress in the first recording of Purcell's Dido and Aeneas, in days, perhaps I should add, when ideas about the performance of such things were rather different from today. Jared's was a big voice. Like Eva Turner, Walter Widdop and Norman Allen, she sang a lot of Wagner, and her Erda in Das Rheingold was something of a sensation at her Covent Garden debut in 1934. When given a chance, the English singers always acquitted themselves with credit in those international seasons. Widdop, for instance, was described by very critical critics as a heroic tenor whom any German opera house would be proud to own. Eva Turner, of course, was the shining proof that it was possible for a British singer to stand in any company, and in some respects outsing the lot. Her return to Covent Garden after some years abroad appears, by all press accounts, to have been the most astonishing event in the whole history of singing at the house in those years. And in a recently published record, we can hear her on stage with Martinelli in the coronation season of 1937, rising with cleaving power and pure-toned brilliance. The world of Puccini's Turandot is as remote from the Serenade to Music as Peking is from Belmont or the Albert Hall. But the power and radiance of Eva Turner's voice had somehow to be incorporated, and Vaughan Williams devised a broad, sweeping phrase that mounts by degrees to a full-voiced high A. It follows after the three contraltos so far named, and it comes before the last, who rounds off the episode with those haunting lines, "The moon sleeps with Endymion and would not be awaked." So, the order of the singers here is Muriel Brunskill, Astrid Esmond, Mary Jared, Eva Turner, and last, the deepest of the contraltos, Margaret Balfour. And so, with a magical 2 bars in which the solo violin leads the music up into the night sky, the serenade returns to its beginning in preparation for its ending. But before we follow it there, let's remind ourselves of the inspiration for it all and the occasion when it was first heard on October the 5th, 1938. The Albert Hall was packed to overflowing. 8,000 were present. There were special trains from Yorkshire and South Wales, 4 orchestras, 3 choirs, and 16 famous soloists, and Rachmaninoff, not to mention Sir Henry himself. Everybody appears to have been happy except the critics. Ernest Newman was placed in a back seat in what he called a sort of cubbyhole, and he refused to write about the music at all. It might have been better if the Observer's critic, Fox Strangways, had followed his example, for he appears to have heard a different piece of music altogether. A still Rheingold-like entry for the voices, he says, goes abruptly into C major, a low trumpet call, and it was over. Well, behind the scenes, the 16 famous ones found themselves somewhat constricted. Roy Henderson.
Rather crowded in the dressing rooms. Men were in one and the women were in another. And in the other dressing room, where the women were, Rachmaninoff planted himself. And he planted himself just outside the ladies' lavatory. And somebody had to tell him to move because the ladies really wanted to get into the lavatory. The actual occasion of walking onto that platform, there were 16 of us, was rather remarkable.
Rachmaninoff continued to make his presence felt. Jessie Wood tells how moved he seemed by the performance of the new work, indeed so overcome by emotion that he had to retire to the back of the VIP's box, which also had in it the famous conductor Felix Weingartner, sitting there very correct and formal in his high stiff collar. "What is the matter with him?" he asked. "Is he going to be sick?" Still, it was a moving occasion, and Vaughan Williams' conception came as a surprise to critics and others who had expected a loud fanfare for Sir Henry. He himself, in the midst of it all, was the subject of one of the most affectionate of musical demonstrations. He was dearly loved, as a personal friend, by what he regarded as his family. Dame Eva, I'm sure, speaks for them all.
It was wonderful, and the atmosphere was so wonderful. But you know, Sir Henry was a marvellous man. What he achieved on the minimum rehearsals was fantastic. It was wonderful, and he was always so nice with the artists. So nice.
He'd done so much for music in England, and he cared greatly for its future.
I am no prophet, but it is a heartening thought to look forward to our meeting here for the first night of my 50th season of promenade concerts next year, with the lights up, no blackout, to join in singing with full hearts, God Save the King.
The voice of the man whom, as the Manchester Guardian put it, the crowd called Sir Henry, and sometimes Sir Henry, a rare tribute to a musician, the Guardian said. On a day when the paper was full of the Munich crisis, Duff Cooper's resignation, and the worst October gales in living memory, they found space and time for a leader on this man who'd become a national institution. And the words which they found most apt to quote were those of the other great man of this Jubilee concert. He might, wrote Vaughan Williams, if he had chosen, have become a star conductor in America, with first-class orchestras and unlimited rehearsal. But he refused all those tempting offers and remained in our country, working ceaselessly under incredible difficulties to bring the music he loved home to the ordinary Englishman. And that, the Guardian added, is the truest tribute of all to the people's conductor.